Hi, good afternoon, thank you everyone, and just like before I start to thank David and Paula for inviting me to deliver this talk. So my focus is going to be on my current project, Frankenstein's camera. But before I get into that, I just want to take a couple of minutes to give you a little bit of a sense of some of my previous work to help put this new project into context. So for me, the sense that, as Sontag writes, a photograph is something stenciled directly off the reel has always been a very powerful draw to the medium, and one far more potent in many ways than its visual analogic perfection. And it was a similar sense that first prompted me to start working with real-time and recorded data. Because like photography, it similarly points to the existence of a source in the world. And in the works I made for my PhD, I explored how I might combine my photographs with data by writing my own custom software programs. And this was an idea that was based very much on the understanding that a digital photograph displayed on screen is not simply a remediation of a chemical photograph, but the output of an active computational process. But working on these projects also changed how I thought about my own practice and led me to think less about the photograph as a trace, as being caused by something in the world, and more as a kind of performative gesture that points towards something in that world. And using code to augment my photographs with other non-visual data could thus be read as a kind of extension of that gesture, but one that is, in my mind at least, still closely bound up with the real. And about 4 years ago, when I first started to work with machine learning or with artificial intelligence, I wasn't especially interested in producing synthetic images, but I was interested in their training sets, the foundation on which these contemporary machine learning systems are built. And these training sets are important because, as Kate Crawford and Trevor Paglen put it in their 2019 essay, Excavating AI, they aren't simply raw materials to feed algorithms. Indeed, I would argue that data is never raw, but are political interventions filled with questions about who gets to decide what images mean and what kinds of social and political work these representations perform. Wrong way. So for my work Light Leaks, I took a series of errors, sort of glowing visual artifacts reminiscent of the damage inflicted on film by a camera that is not fully light tight, that were generated during one of my first attempts to train a GAN, and fed them through the image captioning model IM2Text, which is trained on the Common Objects in Context, or COCO dataset. This is a relatively small dataset with around 80 object categories that is used to teach machines to see. And through this process, strange pairings began to emerge. In these light leaks, IM2Text would see, albeit with extremely low confidence, traffic lights, people holding cell phones, and pairs of scissors a lot. Finally, I used the captions that were generated by IM2Text as the input for an image generator called AtGAN, which produced the strange distorted images that you can see on the right here. So Light Leaks was an interesting experiment which achieved what it set out to do in terms of directing attention to some of the limitations and the biases of machine learning training sets in what I thought was quite a poetic fashion. But as an artist and photographer, I also found working with AI in this way quite constricting, in the sense that I struggled to see how I might use it in my work in a way that did not simply act as a critical reflection on the apparatus of artificial intelligence. And while I certainly continue to regard my work as aligned with a critical AI art practice, as opposed to some of the more perhaps techno-formalist approaches that Joanna Zielinska memorably termed a glorified version of Candy Crush, what I am trying to do with Frankenstein's camera is to find a way to work with this new form of technical image as part of an expanded photographic practice. And while there are numerous examples of artists who have successfully used their own photographs to train GANs, Anna Ridler's Mosaic Virus and Tim Murray Brown's Diffeomorphism are two projects which immediately spring to mind. I wanted to see if I could use generative AI in a manner more akin to how I work with data and code, to combine my own photographs, my own performative or visualizing gesture, with elements created by AI, blurring the line between the two and expanding the photograph in new directions. So we all know the broad outline of Mary Shelley's most famous novel. Victor Frankenstein is a young, ambitious student, unanchored in philosophy or the arts, who believes that he has unearthed the secrets of life and death, and that he alone is capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. He toils alone in his rooms to build the body of a man, one of tremendous stature, out of body parts stolen from graves and anatomy labs, and brings his creation to life with a bolt of electricity, only to immediately recoil from this demonical corpse he has created. Victor abandons the creature, setting in motion a chain of events which ends with his death in the high Arctic as he pursues the creature across the icy plains. And first published anonymously in 1818, Frankenstein is often identified by literary scholars as the first true science fiction novel, in the sense that its plot owes much to early 19th century advances in natural philosophy. But where it veers into fiction, it is a cautionary tale of scientific hubris, the perils of adopting a mechanistic view towards nature and the ethics of creating artificial life. 200 years after its first publication, its influence endures in many of the cautionary tales that we tell ourselves about AI. And I think that if Frankenstein were written today, the role of Victor would almost certainly be taken up by big tech. While the most prolific of these tales focus on the dangers of a general artificial superintelligence, with Frankenstein's camera, I am trying to weave a more optimistic narrative about generative AI, using Shelley's text as a point of departure to explore the possibilities of this new form of technical image, whilst also acknowledging the messy reality of their origins. In short, I'm trying to invite the viewer to reflect on my images and those produced by generative AI more broadly as Frankenstein images which, like Frankenstein's creature, have been sutured together from many different and often ill-gotten parts and given life, or in the case of photographic images, the impression of being taken in light by artificial means. And I first began to draw these parallels between Frankenstein and generative AI 2 summers ago. So one of the projects I run with students up in Glasgow is focused on creative machine learning. And until quite recently, we were making heavy use of an application called Runway. Specifically, it's ML Lab, which acted as an interface to a range of different machine learning models. So this could either be done directly through the Runway app or via an application programming interface from a coding environment such as processing or p5.js. But more importantly, however, it was a very accessible program and it allowed users to experiment with training their own models using a technique called transfer learning, which essentially means retraining or fine-tuning an existing model using your own data set. For a class demonstration, I decided to train a custom GPT-2 text generation model, which is an earlier version of the large language model that underpins ChatGPT, on a data set of Mary Shelley's writing. So the data set used to train my model was gathered from Project Gutenberg and contains, in addition to Frankenstein, Shelley's post-apocalyptic novel The Last Man, lesser-known historical fictions like Valpersia, and the travel memoir History of a 6 Weeks Tour, an account of 2 journeys Mary took through Europe with her lover Percy Shelley and her stepsister Claire Claremont. And my decision to focus on generating first descriptions and then later images of landscape stemmed from the fact that Shelley was very much a writer in the Romantic tradition, and a common theme that runs through this writing, which is also quite evident in Frankenstein, is the idea that exposure to the natural world is, in a sense, good for the soul. And this sentiment was a reaction to the Industrial Revolution, but it's also one that finds some purchase in my own work, which, without going into too much detail, is often explored how, as Robert Macfarlane put it, more and more of us live more and more separately from contact with nature, and the implications this holds for how we know the world. So these next slides, these are a few examples of the kind of descriptions the model was generating. Things like ruined castles, precipices, dark woods, they come up a lot, as you might imagine, given the content of the data set. So the first images that I made from these descriptions were generated using Runway's text-to-image model, which is based on the open source Stable Diffusion 1.5 model, which I think I'm right in saying was initially trained on the lain 2B dataset of around 2 billion images. This is a subset of the larger lain 5B dataset, which contains about 5.85 billion images. And I found that the images which emerged from this process were technically impressive, albeit somewhat uncanny. Their synthetic nature betrayed by twisted turrets and unrooted trees. But they elicited from me little more than a general and polite interest. I found the process of sitting behind a computer attempting to conjure photographic images with words unfulfilling, and that even when I used my own words, I had ceded too much control over the image to the AI. And I was also deeply uncomfortable with the extent to which these images are reliant on material scraped or stolen, to put it in the same unequivocal terms as Hito Sterl, from the internet. And I think we've already talked earlier about the Getty Images watermark appearing in these images. Not content with relying on the default model, I resolved to explore how I might combine or augment my own landscape photographs with diffusion-based generative AI. I also decided to keep working with Shelley's text for the prompts, only this time it was for decidedly more personal reasons. So in her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Shelley writes that as a girl, she passed a considerable time in Scotland and that her habitual residence was on the blank and dreary shores of the Tay near Dundee. These shores became for her an eyrie of freedom, writing that it was beneath the trees of the grounds belonging to her house or on the bleak sides of mountains near that her true compositions, the airy flights of her imagination, were born and fostered. And this resonated with me because when I first began to work with photography, I too spent some considerable time amongst woodless mountains in the Glens of Angus, which are just to the north of Dundee. And it was there, armed with an Olympus OM1 and a battered Agfo synchro box, that I first began to learn what Ansel Adams famously described as the art of visualisation, that entire emotional mental process of creating a photograph. Which importantly identifies the need to maintain control over the camera and limit the use of automation as a prerequisite for creativity and artistic expression. Oh, sorry. So to create the landscape images which comprise Frankenstein's camera, I've been working closely with Runway's image-to-image model, which technically speaking is a type of style transfer model intended to take one image, a photograph say, and using a text prompt output it in another style, as a watercolour, charcoal drawing, something like that. But more controversially, these models are often used to render images in the style of a particular artist. They're not really intended to be used to modify the content of the image, to render the ruins of a castle or a dusting of snow on a mountain peak. And while there is nothing in Runway's interface to prevent image-to-image being used in this way, my doing so could potentially be read as an example of what the artist and curator John Ippolito has described as creative misuse, of using the technology in a manner that runs counter to its intended use to uncover its hidden potential. So to make these images, I took a selection of my own photographs and modified them using the default image-to-image model and descriptions of landscapes generated by the GPT-2 model trained on Shelley's writing. The interface allowed me to vary the weight of the text prompt, essentially how much the model would modify the original photograph. So keeping it quite low allowed me to make these quite subtle modifications, whereas dialing it higher would have a much more dramatic effect. And at first this was working well, but I ran into trouble when Runway, which is a web-based application, updated its interface to remove the option to vary the prompt weight. So overnight, my images went from looking something like this to this. I confess this is a particularly bad one. And I think we've talked about this already, but artists whose work relies on materials or tools produced by commercial companies have long struggled with what happens when these are updated or discontinued. And I think this is particularly true of new media work. But what I found so unsettling about this particular incident was the speed with which the tool appeared and then just disappeared. And my problems were compounded in November last year when Runway announced it was sunsetting its entire ML lab, meaning I could no longer work with my custom text model or access any of the resources underpinning older works like light leaks. And to be fair, I mean, it's not my intention here to single out Runway for criticism. I think this speaks to a much broader challenge of employing these kind of commercial generative AI tools in a creative practice, which again has already been touched on earlier in this conference. But despite these problems, I continued to persevere, this time employing a data set of my own landscape photographs, again, all taken in the Angus Glens, to train a custom model to use with image to image, which, while not completely restoring the finely grained control I had earlier, did at least produce images which more closely resembled my original photographs. And I also began to experiment with text prompts lifted directly from Frankenstein. In doing so, however, what I've come to realise is that this project is increasingly being shaped by the tool as I continually revisit and revise my process to try and bring this work to some kind of conclusion. So the images produced by generative AI are the latest example of what the philosopher Willem Flusser calls a technical image. An image produced automatically by an apparatus, which importantly is not just a machine, but also encompasses the software that runs on that machine and the broader infrastructures that program the software. In one passage in Into the Universe of Technical Images, Flusser uses the comparison of a photographer making a photograph of a house and a computer operator creating a model of an airplane that does not yet exist to show how the same productive power to envision, to draft information, is at work, no matter what form the technical image takes. In the past, I've reflected that my own practice often combines elements of both the photographer and the computer operator. When I work with my camera, I choose what I want to photograph, and I reach for concepts like aperture and shutter speed to grasp what I have visualized. When I work with code, I reach for functions, pixel arrays, RGB color values, concepts that, should I wish, would allow me to modify a single pixel. And this same productive power is at work in diffusion-based generative AI systems like image to image, but control over the image remains elusive. I reach for concepts like prompt weight, seed, but mostly I find myself reaching for words, for these systems are ultimately predicated on a mistaken and mechanistic assumption that images can be exhausted by literal description. There is very little room for poetry in prompt writing, and I can think of perhaps no better illustration of this than when only a few weeks ago I found myself sitting with my copy of Frankenstein and drawing a red line through Shelley's words, stripping her richly detailed prose to its most basic as I tried to coax a coherent image from the machine. And I realised then that the most important concept I had to reach for was the same one with which I'd started, the data set. As I was trying to express with earlier works like light leaks, machine learning AI systems are only ever as good as the data they're trained on, a point which is perhaps best summed up by the artist and researcher Eric Salvaggio when he writes that every AI-generated image is an infographic about the data set, and they tell us stories about the data set and the human decisions behind it. Frankenstein's camera is no exception. When I sat pruning Mary's words, it was because I felt myself pushing up against the linguistic limits of the model. But more importantly, I've come to realise that with this work, I am not, in fact, using generative AI to augment my photographs. I am using my photographs with Shelley's words to direct the output of the model. And this is a subtle difference, but for me it's a useful one because it's helped to clarify in my mind the relationship between my images, text prompts, and the model's foundational data sets, as well as to how and to what extent I can direct generative AIs, or at the very least image-to-images, visualising gesture. Ultimately, the resulting images blurring of photography and AI proves to be another infographic. And while I might have come across a useful creative process in that I can use my own photographs as data to make the model follow my ideas, as Lev Manovich puts it. In the long run, I am still undecided as to whether I can ever truly reconcile my use of these systems with the material and the human costs of their creation. I think aside from the issue of stolen data, generative AI is incredibly power and water hungry, which poses an additional ethical and conceptual problem for works like mine, which concern themselves with the natural world and the non-human. At the same time, however, I do not think, as Nicholas put it yesterday, that refusing to engage with these tools is the answer. So these last few images are all drawn from what I hope will be the project's final iteration. And most of them have been derived from the passages in Frankenstein leading up to Victor's first face-to-face encounter with the creature since he abandoned it in Ingolstadt. And the first time in the novel, we get to hear the creature's side of the story. So we learned that he spent many months watching a peasant family from a distance and developed a strong emotional attachment to them, only to be violently rejected as a monster when he finally chose to reveal himself. It was in this moment that he decided to turn away from humanity for good. And while one of the key issues at the heart of Shelley's novel is that of scientific responsibility, and specifically Victor's failure to take responsibility for or to care for his creation, I think it's also strongly implied that were it not for this second rejection, the story might have ended quite differently. And I do think this point should give us pause for thought. We may not be the modern day Frankensteins who built these systems and set them loose upon the world, but this does not necessarily mean that we do not share some of the responsibility for where they go from here. If we are to have any influence on generative AI's future development, I think it's important that we do not reject it out of fear for what it might mean for photography, for art, or for education. We need to learn about it, we need to question it, we need to experiment with it. And I think, if we can do that, hopefully, in the future, we will have some more hopeful stories to tell about AI. Thank you.